Welcome to iWizard. Nikki here. In this episode of Origins of the Modern Vampire, we're going to unearth the Romantic and Victorian Femme Fatales, the female predators, beginning with their sources of inspiration. Last episode focused on Lord Byron, the Shelleys, Dr. Polidori, and the first aristocratic vampire. So if you haven't done so already, be sure to check it out. And keep in mind, these are standalone episodes, so you can watch them in any order. Also, please like this video and subscribe to iWizard for more sci-fi, horror, and fantasy content. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Delicate, transparent skin, fine, silky hair, sparkling or dilated eyes, rosy cheeks, red lips. You might think I've just described a vampire, but these are the common physical signs of consumption or tuberculosis. From the 17th to 19th century in Europe, TB caused 25% of all deaths, mostly claiming the young, particularly those between age 20 and 24. And for that reason, it became known as the robber of youth, in addition to the white plague, due to the anemic pallor of those infected. By the close of the 18th century, TB was becoming aestheticized and entwined with feminine beauty. The aristocrats believed that one could judge a woman's predisposition to TB by her attractiveness. Those infected would waste away, growing pale and emaciated while flushed with fever. They were believed to have heightened sensitivity. Of course, Byron even remarked, I think, to die of consumption, because then all the women would say, see that poor Byron? How interesting he looks in dying. I doubt poor Keats, who did die of consumption at age 25 in 1821, would have shared Byron's sentiment. Apparently, Keats would cry upon waking, joyous to find himself still alive. When his body was autopsied, one of his lungs had completely disintegrated from the disease. The travesty of the disease didn't quell the elite's consumptive chic aspirations either. They wore pale powder, rouge, red lipstick, cinched corsets beneath dresses with tight bodices and full skirts for the offset to make their waists appear even smaller and more waif-like. We see this mirrored in the romanticization of vampires and their associated symptoms. In early vampire literature, one didn't turn instantly like we see with the modern vampire today. It was a slow, wasting process, much like consumption. A vampire would feed on a young waif for days, weeks, or even longer, and that poor damsel would slowly waste away, growing weaker and weaker, and increasingly more sensitive to her environment, especially light and sound. We get the puncture wounds on the neck and the loss of blood, similar to the anemic quality of consumption. In the advanced stages of consumption, blood may even be coughed up, as we often see in movies and read in books, and this mirrors the process of the thrall consuming the vampire's blood. Before Robert Koch's discovery of germ theory in 1882, it was thought that consumption was spread by miasmas, or bad air. In other words, it was just airborne. This was also a theory on how vampirism spread, since it tended to infect the young and beautiful in any given location, because they were more likely to be out flitting about society. While the first few literary vampires were male predators, it didn't take long for female vampires to surpass the males in popularity. Even in some of the early vampire ballads, like Bürger's Lenore from 1774, we actually get an Ophelia-like protagonist, in contrast to the male protagonist in Ossenfelder's Der Vampir from 1748, in which the beau of the victim, Christiana, tells the tale of the vampire, a Hungarian sexual predator inspired by the real vampire, Arnold Paul. And that was a case from 2 decades earlier, and I talk at length about that in episode 1, so check that out if you're interested. And the reason that I put vampire in air quotes is that Lenore isn't a typical vampire tale, in that the vampire is never called a vampire, nor does he act truly like one. And a side note here, I am no literary expert. My background is in engineering and physics, so this channel is my way of learning more about the humanities, and I've been enjoying reading Romantic and Victorian poetry so much. It's not surprising that Lenore was much more widely read than Der Vampire, because it is seriously fantastic. And I read the 1844 translation, which was done by a 16-year-old at the time, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And here's the gist of it. Lenore wakes up early to greet the parade of men returning from war because she's searching for her young husband, William, among them. And clank, clank, clank came every rank, with the trumpet sound that rose and sank. But ah, for the sweet lips of Lenore, the kiss and the greeting are vanished and over. From man to man, all wildly she ran, with a swift and searching eye. But she felt alone in the mighty mass, as it crushed and crowded by. On hurried the troop, a gladsome group, and proudly the tall plumes wave and droop. She tore her hair and she turned her round, and madly she dashed her against the ground. And I just love how vivid that scene is. And after a bit of time, the reality sets in. William's not there because he's died at war. And of course, Lenore is devastated. And her mother tries to console her, to no avail. And Lenore replies, "My mother, what is happiness? My mother, what is hell? With William is my happiness. Without him is my hell. Spark of my life. Down, down to the tomb, die away in the night, die away in the gloom. Earth and heaven and earth, reft of William, are nothing worth." And then some time passes, Lenore continues to mourn, and undead William returns one night at around 11 p.m. Till from her light veil of the moon shone through, and the stars leapt out on the darkling blue. But hark to the clatter and the pat-pat-patter of a horse's heavy hoof. "Holla, holla, unlock the gate. Art waking, my bride, or sleeping? Is thy heart still free and still faithful to me? Art laughing, my bride, or weeping?" And William continues, "Up, up, and away. I must not stay. Mount swiftly behind me. Up, and away. 100 miles must be ridden and sped, ere we may lie down in the bridal bed." And of course, she's like, well, it's 11 at night and we're riding 100 miles. Can this wait till morning? And also, where is the chamber, William dear? And William, where is the bed? Far, far from here, still narrow and cool, plank and bottom and lid. Sounds like he's describing a coffin, which is in fact what he is describing. But no matter, her William has returned. So Lenore wraps her arms around his waist and they ride away together. And as they ride, we keep getting this refrain. William asks her again and again, "Is my love afraid of the quiet dead?" And she answers, "Alas, let them sleep in their dusty bed." They reach their destination, eventually the graveyard, and day is breaking. And then at daybreak, William, the horseman's jerkin, piece by piece, dropped off like brittle tinder, fleshless and hairless, a naked skull. The sight of his weird head was horrible. The lifelike mask was there no more, and a scythe and a sandglass the skeleton bore. And so, of course, we do not get the traditional vampire elements here other than the coffin and the nighttime visit. And often in these vampire tales, the full moon is described. And when William turns into a skeleton, Lenore gets scared because, of course, she doesn't want to die, but it's too late, and she does perish at the end of the ballad. Edgar Allan Poe also wrote a poem called Lenore in 1831, in which a beautiful young woman dies. And he once said, "The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world." And so the ending of Bürger's ballad there clearly conjured the question, what if Lenore rose again? Okay, and this once again ignited the imagination of the Romantics so they could explore the most poetical topic in the world further through the Femme Fatale. As far as I know, the first she-vampire appears in Goethe's 1797, The Bride of Corinth. And I read multiple translations to piece together what was going on in that poem. So there's an arranged marriage between an Athenian boy and a Corinthian girl that's set for when they come of age. And years later, the young woman's family has converted to Christianity, while the young man and his family remain heathens, as it's put in the poem. The wedding stays set as scheduled, and the Athenian is excited to meet his new family and friends in Corinth. And so the bridegroom sets out on his long journey, and it's late when he arrives in Corinth. The father and daughters are in bed, and he's welcomed by the mother with food and wine. He's so exhausted that he has no hunger or thirst and collapses in bed with his trousers still on. And then he's visited in the night by his fiance's sister. And this is from a modern translation by David Gosselin, and I have his Substack linked below. By his shimmering night lamp, he beholds a maiden wearing a veil and robe, appearing with angels' graces and silken folds, and sporting a band of black and gold. But as she saw him, by a light so dim, she revealed a hand, pallid and cold. And she's surprised that there's a guest in the house. And so she's complaining that no one ever tells her anything. And essentially, her family treats her like a prisoner. So he, of course, young woman in his bed, he asks her to stay. And she warns him, "Stay away, please, young soul, stay far away. Joy's grape no longer greets my palate. I know no bliss or light or even day." And of course, he keeps begging her. He's like, "Please be mine, stay." And she responds, "Although you may never have my hand, love, my fair sister will be your delight. When I'm in darkness below, you above, think of me as you hold her tight," which is so bold. And yet, he continues to beg, "Come with me to my father's home." And then eventually, she gives in. They exchange gifts, tokens of their faith. So then they snuggle, holding each other closely, neither contained, their tears falling with the sweetest ardor. His hot breath surged through her ice-cold frame. Each thought of nothing but the other. So a fiery flood warmed her frozen blood. But alas, no heart beat inside her. And so they continue embracing and making out, and the mother hears kissing coming from his room. And so she walks in on them. And obviously she freaks out because her dead daughter is in bed with her potential new son-in-law, or her soon-to-be son-in-law. So the sister here is a she-vampire, and in general, the she-vampire is a Lamia-like seductress who appears at night straddling dreams, much like a succubus. And Nick Groom, in his The Vampire, A New History, if you're really interested in vampires, definitely give it a read, writes that the female vampire is a challenge to marriage, social stability, and childbearing, a general threat to young women is what she represents. And we see this comparison to the Lamia plainly in Coleridge's Christabel, which is about Christabel's encounter with the she-vampire Geraldine in a cemetery by the light of a full moon. Of course. And Christabel invites Geraldine into her home and gets her settled into a room where the vamp undresses in front of Christabel. Beneath the lamp, the lady bowed and slowly rolled her eyes around. Then drawing in her breath aloud, like one that shuddered, she unbound the cincture from beneath her breast. Her silken robe and inner vest dropped to her feet, and in full view, behold, her bosom and half her side, a sight to dream of, not to tell. Oh, shield her, shield sweet Christabel. And we're getting a more explicit exploration of female sexuality at this time. And keep in mind, this is the early 19th century. Christabel is famously the poem that Byron read aloud on that famed night in La Via Diodati in Switzerland that led to the creation of Frankenstein and the vampire. And Coleridge later describes Geraldine similar to that of the Lamia, half serpent, half woman. A snake's small eye blinks dull and shy, and the lady's eyes, they shrunk in her head, each shrunk up to a serpent's eye. And with somewhat of malice and more of dread, at Christabel she looked askance. One moment and the sight was fled, but Christabel, in dizzy trance, stumbling on the steady ground, shuddered loud with a hissing sound. We can easily follow the thread of inspiration to Keats's 1819 Lamia. Hermes, the Greek god of travel, messages, oration, wit, etc., stole light from Olympus and entered the enchanted woods, searching in vain for the location of his beloved nymph's secret bed. And eventually he hears a mournful voice. When from this wreathed tomb shall I awake? When move in a sweet body fit for life? Of hearts and lips, ah, miserable me. And then, of course, Hermes rushes to the voice, and there he finds a snake. She was a Gordian shape of dazzling hue, vermilion spotted, golden green, and blue. Striped like a zebra, freckled like a pard, eyed like a peacock, and all crimson barred, and full of silver moons, that as she breathed, dissolved, or brighter shone, or interwreathed, their lustres with gloomier tapestries, so rainbow-sided, touched with miseries. She seemed, at once, some penance lady elf, some demon's mistress, or the demon's self. And so while her head was that of a snake, she had a woman's mouth with all its pearls complete. So the snake greets and praises Hermes, to which he replies, "Thou smooth-lipped serpent, surely high inspired, thou beauteous wreath with melancholy eyes, possess whatever bliss thou canst devise, telling me only where my nymph is fled, where she doth breathe." And so then she makes Hermes swear an oath, and she's like, all right, I made your nymph invisible, and you can see her once more if you grant me my wish. I was a woman, let me have once more, a woman's shape and charming as before. I love a youth of Corinth, oh the bliss. Give me my woman's form and place me where he is. Stoop, Hermes, let me breathe upon thy brow, and thou shalt see thy sweet nymph now. And so Hermes agrees to this, and his beautiful wood nymph appears, and they run off into the woods together. And I have to read you the scene when the Lamia changes. Left to herself, the serpent now began to change. Her elfin blood in madness ran. Her mouth foamed, and the grass therewith besprent, withered at dew so sweet and virulent. Her eyes in torture fixed, and anguish drear, hot, glazed, and wide, with lid lashes all sear, flashed phosphor in sharp sparks, without one cooling tear. The colors all inflamed throughout her train. She writhed about, convulsed with scarlet pain. A deep Vulcanian yellow took the place of all her milder mooned body's grace. And as the lava ravishes the mead, spoilt all her silver mail and golden breed, made gloom of all her freckling streaks and bars, eclipsed her crescents, and licked up her stars, so that in moments few she was undressed of all her sapphires, greens, and amethyst, and rubious argent. Of all these bereft, nothing but pain and ugliness were left. Still shone her crown, that vanished also she, melted and disappeared as suddenly. And to me, this totally evokes Ursula's transformation in my mind. Like, is Ursula also Lamia? And is this kind of the Little Mermaid? It seems like it a bit. I think it probably got some of its inspiration from there. And so Lamia flees. She's now transformed into a lady bright, and she goes off to woo Lycius. And so Long story short, Lycius falls for Lamia and they live together in solitude for a time. But eventually, he wants to have a marriage celebration with Lamia and brings her home excited for her to meet his friends and family. And her only conditional of this is that Lycius's old teacher, the philosopher Apollonius, not be invited. But his old teacher comes anyway, and Lycius notices that the philosopher has fixed his eye without twinkle or stir on the bride. Lycius then pressed her hand with devout touch, as pale it lay upon the rosy couch. 'Twas icy, and the cold ran through his veins. Then sudden it grew hot, and all the pains of an unnatural heat shot to his heart. Lamia, what means this? Wherefore dost thou start? Know'st that man? Poor Lamia answered not, and he gazed at her, and some hungry spell that loveliness absorbs. There was no recognition in those orbs. And so now Lycius is freaking out. He continues to call her name, Lamia, 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 and everyone grows silent, sensing the horrid presence, and the marriage festivities come to a halt. Lamia, he shrieked, and nothing but the shriek. With its sad echo did the silence break. Begone, foul dream, he cried, gazing again in the bride's face, where now no azure vein wandered on fair spaced temples, no soft bloom misted the cheek, no passion to illume. The deep recessed vision all was blight. Lamia, no longer fair, there sat a deadly white. And so this also reminds me of William changing into a skeleton before Lenore's eyes in the cemetery. And so the philosopher, Lycius's teacher, recognizes who he has married and begins calling him a fool. Fool, fool, repeated he, while his eyes still relented not nor moved. From every ill of life have I preserved thee to this day, and shall I see thee made a serpent's prey. And as usual with these tales, it is too late. And Lycius dies. At the end, he has been consumed by the Lamia. All right, so I'm not going to go through all the 19th century she-vampires because there are a lot. Just keep in mind that there are so many because most 19th century vampires in literature were, in fact, female. Brief side note, if you are interested in some wonderful fiction that incorporates Lamia and vampires with the lives of the young romantics, Byron, Keats, Shelley, check out Tim Powers' The Stress of Her Regard. And I did a review on it a long time ago if you're interested in learning more. And the plot essentially begins with a retelling of Scottish poet Henry Thomas Liddell's Vampire Bride from 1833, which I believe was also the inspiration for Tim Burton's The Corpse Bride. And so as you'd imagine, the Vampire Bride begins with a wedding. With hand joined to hand at the altar they stand, and loudly the choristers sing, when a shuddering came over Albert's frame, and he dropped his bridal ring. As downward he bent with swift intent, that precious ring to save, he heard a ground neath the altar stone, and the church smelled like a grave. This is very much like when Victor, Johnny Depp's character in The Corpse Bride, drops his ring in the forest and it lands on the skeleton finger of Helena Bonham Carter. And in Liddell's version, Albert really can't hold on to his ring and he drops it again on the tennis courts later that day. And soon 'tis his chance to score to advance, when his ring he did let fall. And lo, close at hand did its statue stand on its marble pedestal. So he gets kind of inspired by the statue. 'Tis a good thought, says Albert, caught by the bright and proffered hand, and without more delay on the finger of clay he slid the mystic band. And this is the exact scene that takes place in Stress of Her Regard when Dr. Crawford slips his wedding ring on the finger of a statue in the garden. And then the statue's finger bends down and the ring gets stuck. So next in The Vampire Bride, Albert sends a boy to break the statue's finger, and he reports back, "O master dear, no ring is there, no finger bent at all, but the statue doth stand with extended hand on its lofty pedestal. And in stress of her regard, Crawford accidentally weds a Lamia and wakes up to blood and gore in his marriage bed. And so my husband, Jordan, actually did lose his wedding ring working in the fields at Cornell. Fortunately, he did find it after a long time searching and got it resized, and he didn't accidentally marry a Lamia. And as you'd expect in the case of the Vampire Bride, Albert does accidentally wed a vampire. And then he goes to bed with his new bride, the alive one, and she becomes cold and transforms in his arms. The couch smelled like a grave, and then the statue/vampire appears and proclaims, "Thou this day didst me wed, and I come to thy bed, thy nuptial joys to share, and in token true, the sapphire blue on my finger still I wear." Another bitter cry, and he senseless did lie, for the phantom marble pressed its lonesome form against his bosom warm, and weighed down his laboring breast. And ever and anon murmured the lips of stone, "This bridal couch is thine. To thy bed I come, but ere 3 days are gone, Albert, thou comest to mine." And so, unhappily he lay there in his nuptial bed, which is cold as the coffined clay. And then eventually the demon flew away in the sight of the blushing dawn. The next day, in a still virgin living bride seek out the help of a priest who sits in their bedchamber that night. Even so, the demon returns and exhorts her power over Albert. He lay like a corse 'neath the demon's force, and she wrapped him in a shroud, and she fixed her teeth, his heart beneath, and she drank of the warm life blood. So then, the day after that, Albert and his real bride marched to the demon's tomb, accompanied by a train of priests wielding pickaxes and spades. 5 yards underground, a coffin they found, of strange unwonted shape, and the cold wet clay was red where it lay, and the coffin lid did gape. They lifted the lid, and the shroud they undid, but what they saw underneath, the horrible sight that congealed them quite, I almost fear to breathe. Beneath the shroud, stained and spotted with blood, a female naked lay. On her clenched hand shone a sapphire stone. In her corpse there was no decay. And this is one of the common traits of the vampire that we see in the German lore and so forth, that there is no decay in the corpse, that the corpse is actually swollen and kind of has like rougy cheeks. Her veins accursed seemed ready to burst. She was gorged with infernal food, and the vampire mouth foamed with crimson froth. Her very pores oozed blood. And I love that Albert's virgin bride in this case is the heroine of the tale. She plunges into the grave and she yanks that ring from the vampire's finger. When they thrust a dart through its swollen heart, it convulsively shivered and screamed, and the red blood thereout did gush and did spout till it sprinkled the chancel roof. So venomous it sprung that no fountain ever flung with like force its waters aloof. So after this graphic Quentin Tarantino style eruption of blood, the vampire's body is fed to the wolves. And uncharacteristic of these stories, Albert and his bride, his living bride, actually do live happily ever after, though his scar does weep blood every year on the anniversary of that bite. All right, finally, we now enter the Victorian period. Keep in mind that the White Plague, TB, was still raging at this time, as was consumption chic. And I mentioned last video that Lord Byron was essentially the first rock star, but now we're seeing more and more celebrities emerge, including actresses and courtesans who are often one in the same. Marie de Plessis was a famous Parisian courtesan, and you can see here in Edouard Vignau's famous portrait of her. She has this glossy black hair, cherry red lips, and ivory skin, so kind of like Snow White, and Alexander Dumas said she looked like a little figurine made of Dresden china. Sadly, Marie died from TB in 1847 at age 23. She inspired Dumas's La Dame à Camilla and Verdi's opera La Traviata, which also in part inspired Moulin Rouge. Shortly before Marie died, she told her maid, "I've always felt that I'll come back to life." And in a way she did, not as a vampire, but her story did live on. That same year, 1847, Jane Eyre was published by Charlotte Brontë, and she likens Mr. Rochester's first wife to the foul German spectre, the vampire. She writes, "The lips were swelled and dark, the brow furrowed, the black eyebrows widely raised over the bloodshot eyes." In his 1852 Metamorphoses of the Vampire, Baudelaire presents a prostitute as a vampire. That poem was actually expunged from his first edition of Les Fleurs du Mal, or The Flowers of Evil. It's also missing from this 1919 edition that I have here. And then in 1897, Kipling published his poem that held similar sentiments called The Vampire, which warned of the man-eater femme. I'm not a huge fan of that version, and I like Baudelaire's a lot better, so here it is. It's short. Let's treat this as an intermission for our headliner, Carmilla, because soon that is where I'm going, I promise. The woman, meanwhile, twisting like a snake on hot coals and kneading her breasts against the steel of her corset, from her mouth red as strawberries, let flow these words impregnated with musk. I have moist lips, and I know the art of losing old conscience in the depths of a bed. I dry all tears on my triumphant breasts, and old men laugh with the laughter of children. I replace for him who sees me nude, without veils, the moon, the sun, the stars, and the heavens. I am, my dear scholar, so learned in pleasure, that when I smother a man in my fearful arms, or when timid and licentious, frail and robust, I yield my bosom to biting kisses on those two soft cushions which swoon with emotion. The powerless angels would damn themselves for me. When she had sucked out all the marrow from my bones, and I languidly turned toward her to give back an amorous kiss, I saw no more than a wineskin with gluey sides, all full of pus. Frozen with terror, I closed both my eyes, and when I opened them to the bright light, at my side, instead of the robust mannequin, who seemed to have laid in a store of blood, there quivered confusedly a heap of old bones, which of themselves gave forth the cry of a weathercock, or of a sign on the end of an iron rod, that the wind swings to and fro on a winter night. So after spending the night with this prostitute who's likened to a vampire, the man is left drained, cold, and alone. By the time of the famous courtesan Marie Duplessis' death, Sarah Bernhardt, the soon-to-be first modern superstar, was still a toddler. The divine Sarah, real name Henriette, was born in 1844, the illegitimate daughter of a Parisian courtesan. As a child, she had every intention of becoming a nun. However, she was expelled from her convent school after giving a proper Christian burial to her pet lizard. Sarah eventually found her calling as an actress. She was splendid at dying on stage and famously played Ophelia in Hamlet. And she was the first actress to demand that Ophelia be brought back to the stage at the end in an open casket rather than a closed one. She was an artist through and through, and her grandest project was her own identity. Much like Byron, who I'm guessing Sarah was greatly influenced by, she lived an eccentric life and surrounded herself with a menagerie of exotic animals, including a cheetah and alligator, and real human skulls. And of course, Byron famously used to drink out of skulls. Yet Sarah would be able to propel herself to more far-reaching stardom than Byron ever achieved, as she had access to new technologies. She embraced photography and sound recording, eventually serving as Alphonse Mucha's muse in his Art Nouveau posters and skyrocketing Mucha to fame as well. During the Victorian period, a renewed fixation on Shakespeare's Ophelia emerged as a result of the cult of illness and frailty brought on by the TB epidemic, and this was reflected in Victorian art. Sarah was a talented sculptor in her own right, and she merged her own self-portrait with Ophelia in her famous 1880 sculpture. And this was 6 years before she even played Ophelia on stage. So she was already embodying Ophelia, or I guess today we'd say she manifested it, right? And many of her works were self-portraits, including this bronze inkwell where she has dragon wings and a tail. So Sarah explored the femme fatale through her art and attempted to embody its spirit. she actually became the first woman to ever play Hamlet in 1899. She said that a woman is better suited for such parts that portray the youths of 20 with the minds of men of 40. A boy of 20 cannot understand the philosophy of Hamlet. An older man does not look the boy, nor has he the ready adaptability of the woman who can combine the light carriage of youth with the mature thought of the man. The woman more readily looks the part, yet has the maturity of mind to grasp it. I just needed to include her in this Femme Fatale video for a few different reasons. I promise I'll tie it all together. But one of the biggest reasons is that she allegedly slept in a coffin. And you can see her photographed with her coffin here. And speaking of Femme Fatale, Sarah Bernhardt had many lovers. And among her infamous lovers was Victor Hugo, who had a prolific sex life. To put it politely, he claimed to have once slept with 200 women in a 2-year time span. Ew, gross. And notoriously, to mourn Hugo's death, all the brothels in Paris shut down and the prostitutes dressed their privates in black crepe. I suppose if we're making connections, Hugo often included consumption in his works. The Hunchback of Notre Dame's deformity was caused by consumption, and Fantine had consumption in Les Miserables. Okay, I'd like to return to Hamlet for a moment, and rather than getting too deep into the complex drama of Shakespeare's tragedy at this point, just know that Hamlet and Ophelia were in love. Well, at least at some point, and both a touch crazy as well. Hamlet accidentally kills Ophelia's father, Polonius, by stabbing through a curtain while he's arguing with his mother, the Queen of Denmark. He thinks the movement behind the curtain is his uncle Claudius, who has recently married his mother and is now the king. And Hamlet suspects that Claudius murdered his father after his father's ghost told him so. Okay, well, anyway, Ophelia is devastated over her father's murder, of course, and then Hamlet is sent abroad to England by Uncle Claudius, who plans on having Hamlet executed while he's away. Shakespeare shows vividly just how maddened by grief and despair Ophelia is, and has her singing, crying, speaking nonsense following her father's death. And this precedes her own death, in which she ends up falling from a tree and drowning, her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes, as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued onto that element. But long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. And this is the scene that is often depicted in Victorian art. And in the play, we're not told the true cause of Ophelia's death, but it is suspected and seems to have been by suicide. In vampire lore and literature, there are a few major theories as to how vampirism spread. One, I've mentioned earlier, was miasmatic. Another was it was a contagious disease. Nick Groom describes it as a symptom of psychological disturbance and physical ill health, or strange ferments in the blood, or incipient plague, usually seeded by religious fanaticism. A disease of mass panic that is comparable to rabies. A third was from consuming too much opium, or belladonna. And I think belladonna is what the Manson family were on when they committed those grisly murders. And a fourth theoretical cause is suicide, which is the vampirism mechanism Le Fanu cites in Carmilla. A suicide, under certain circumstances, becomes a vampire. That specter visits living people in their slumbers, they die, and almost invariably in the grave develop into vampires. So then it spreads and it spreads. Daniel Quilp in Dickens' The Curiosity Shop, published in 1842, set in the 1820s, is buried with a stake through his heart in the center of 4 lonely roads. After his drowning is deemed to have been a suicide. And by English law, suicides were failos de se, or felons to themselves. And so as punishment for the crime, these deceased felons had their property confiscated and were impaled through the chest with ash stakes and buried at crossroads. So one, this was a humiliating way to get buried, but 2, some thought it was so that they wouldn't rise again as vampires. But this practice was abolished by the Burial of Suicide Act in 1823. Finally, we've arrived at this episode's headliner, Carmilla, published in 1872 by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And Carmilla is the female vampire of the 19th century. If you love vampire stories and you have not read Carmilla, you need to. And it's one of the 5 stories included in Les Fanus in A Glass Darkly. And lengthwise, it's really more of a novella. Les Fanus stays true to the 18th century Enlightenment vampire, the traits and symptoms that we still affiliate with the modern vampire, including how to slay them. And it's also super creepy, and the writing is beautiful. It's written in an epistolary format in which we meet our protagonist Laura in her late 20s, right in an introduction to her narrative of a supernatural encounter she had as a child when she was visited one night by a pretty young lady who crawled into bed with her and soothed her back to sleep. Laura was later wakened by a sensation as if 2 needles ran into her breast very deep. The bulk of the narrative is a much longer event that took place when she was 19. Set in the countryside of Styria, Austria, our teenage protagonist Laura lives with her father, an Englishman, in a Schloss. And this is essentially a castle with, of course, towers and a Gothic chapel included. The Schloss is near a deserted village and a ruined church. Then the nearest inhabited village is several miles away. Laura's life is quite isolated. It's just she and her father and their staff in the castle. She's looking forward to a visit from her father's friend, General Spielsdorf, from his time in the Austrian service, along with Spielsdorf's niece and ward, Bertha, who's around Laura's age. She learns that the general's visit will be delayed because Bertha has died from an abbreviated wasting illness. Very odd for a teenager. Laura is out walking with her father by the light of the full moon. Over the sward and low grounds, a thin film of mist was stealing like smoke, marking the distances with a transparent veil. And here and there, we could see the river faintly flashing in the moonlight. Then they come upon a couple of local women out walking, one of whom is something of a mystic, who says, "The moon this night is full of idyllic and magnetic influence. And see, when you look behind you at the front of the Schloss, how all its windows flash and twinkle with that silvery splendor, as if unseen hands had lighted up the rooms to receive fairy guests." And that's, of course, when a thundering horse-drawn carriage appears on the scene and they witness it overturn. A teenage girl is thrown from the carriage, and the elder woman, presumably the girl's mother, asks where the nearest village is, as she'll have to drop Carmilla there for the next 3 months since she's too weak to travel and the woman needs to be on her way. Of course, Laura's father offers to host the girl, and Laura is ecstatic to have a companion. When they get home, Laura recognizes Carmilla and realizes that she is the same young woman who visited her that night when she was 6 years old. Carmilla headed off this fear by first exclaiming, "How wonderful! 12 years ago, I saw your face in a dream, and it has haunted me ever since," which totally catches Laura off guard. And Laura reflects, "Now the truth is, I felt rather unaccountably towards the beautiful stranger. I did feel," as she said, "drawn towards her, but there was also something of repulsion. In this ambiguous feeling, however, the sense of attraction immensely prevailed. She interested and won me. She was so beautiful and so indescribably engaging." This novella, Carmilla, is known for its strong female characters and lesbian motifs, which I did not know going into reading this, so I didn't have any preconceived notions about it. I wasn't hunting for it in the text. What I did notice is that Laura was sick of being lonely and wanted nothing more than to have some company. And it was largely due to Carmilla's charisma and beauty that Laura brushes aside her eccentricities and red flags. On the flip side, Carmilla is a predator. She knows Laura's weakness is her loneliness. I'm not saying that Carmilla is not a lesbian. Perhaps she is. I'd also like to point out that at this time in the rural countryside, in order for a female vampire who appears but a teenager to have consistent access to blood, it's easiest for her to make and feed off a female friend. While she was alive, we learn much later in the story that Carmilla did have a male lover, a Moravian nobleman. Throughout the story, Laura does grapple with her conflicting feelings of being charmed and repulsed by Carmilla, who is quite affectionate with her hugs, hand-holding, whispers, and kisses on Laura's cheek. From these foolish embraces, which were not a very frequent occurrence, I must allow, I used to wish to extricate myself, but my energies seemed to fail me. Her murmured words sounded like a lullaby in my ear and soothed my resistance into a trance, from which I only seemed to recover myself when she withdrew her arms. So these sound to me like coercive vampire powers. And Laura continues, in these mysterious moods, I did not like her. I experienced a strange, tumultuous excitement that was pleasurable ever and anon, mingled with a vague sense of fear and disgust. I had no distinct thoughts about her while such scenes lasted, but I was conscious of a love growing into adoration and also of abhorrence. This I know is paradox, but I can make no other attempt to explain the feeling. Of course, we as readers know that Carmilla is a vampire from the story's cultural significance, but this is not revealed in the novella until much later on. But when Carmilla proclaims to Laura, "You are mine, you shall be mine, you and I are one forever," I didn't interpret this as love so much as Carmilla's plan to consume Laura's blood and literally become one. This talk is another turnoff for Laura. Are we related? She'd ask. What can you mean by all this? I remind you perhaps of someone whom you love, but you must not. I hate it. I don't know you. I don't know myself when you look and talk so. So girls in the nearby village start to fall ill and die, signifying that maybe a plague or fever might have come, though the young women recall having been seized by their throats as they lay in bed, and delirium is often a symptom associated with fever, but they die slowly over the course of days or weeks. They waste away. Carmilla has these weird habits and traits Laura notices. She locks herself in the bedchamber, does not come downstairs until 1 in the afternoon. And as we'll see in Dracula, as in earlier lore, vampires could go out into the afternoon sun, and Carmilla never participates in prayer. She tends to oscillate between frailty and robust strength as well. And Laura's late mother, who died when Laura was in infancy, came from an old Hungarian family, and numerous old portraits were included in their heirlooms. Many of the pictures were too dirty to decipher, so eventually Laura's father has had them cleaned. And upon their return, Laura observes a portrait of a girl named Mircalla Karnstein, dated 1698. The Karnsteins were a long extinct family who had lived nearby, and the girl in the portrait looked exactly like Carmilla. Let me spell Mircalla for you. Mircalla. As you can imagine, Laura is becoming quite paranoid and begins locking her bedroom door. Thus fortified, I might take my rest in peace, but dreams come through stone walls, light up dark rooms or darken light ones, and their persons make their exits and their entrances as they please and laugh at locksmiths. One night, Laura sees a monstrous black cat around 4 to 5 feet long moving by the foot of her bed. It continued toing and froing with the lithe, sinister restlessness of a beast in a cage. I could not cry out, although, as you may suppose, I was terrified. Its pace was growing faster, and the room rapidly darker and darker, and at length so dark that I could no longer see anything of it but its eyes. I felt it spring lightly on the bed. The 2 broad eyes approached my face, and suddenly I felt a stinging pain as if 2 large needles darted an inch or 2 apart deep into my breast. Immediately afterwards, she saw a female figure standing at the foot of the bed, a little at the right side. It was in a dark, loose dress, and its hair was down and covered its shoulders. A block of stone could not have been more still. There was not the slightest stir of respiration. As I stared at it, the figure appeared to have changed its place and was now nearer the door. Then close to it, the door opened, and it passed out. Just imagine seeing this at the foot of your bed. First, you think you see a big giant cat that jumps onto the bed with you. Then you see like a girl in a nightdress appear and then kind of just shift and shift and shift without moving nearer to the door till she leaves. Like, that is some like horror, just gems. I'm always surprised when I read classic horror just how truly scary it is, and that I feel like we've almost gotten away from that, like that subtle horror that used to be in the classics. And then another night, she hears a female voice in the dark. Your mother warns you to beware of the assassin. Ooh, like seriously, like hear your deceased mother's voice in the dark. Your mother warns you to beware of the assassin. At the same time, a light unexpectedly sprang up, and I saw Carmilla standing near the foot of my bed in her white nightdress, bathed from her chin to her feet in one great stain of blood. Eek! Okay, room lights up, and there she is, chin down, blood. Laura doesn't really know what to make of this. She's scared and she only thinks that like maybe Carmilla's hurt. So she runs for help from her servants and they are unable to locate Carmilla because she's not in her own bedchamber. The next day, Laura's father decides that Carmilla must suffer from somnambulism, which is sleepwalking. Meanwhile, Laura is growing weaker and weaker. I'm going to stop there with the plot. If you want to find out what happens, read Carmilla. I promise it will not disappoint. And there is a masquerade to look forward to. I love Victorian masquerades. Also, a couple more connections here. Dr. Polidori, author of The Vampire, recall Lord Ruthven was an aristocratic vampire. Carmilla is an aristocrat as well. Anyway, Polidori wrote his dissertation on somnambulism, and sleepwalking is also very important in Bram Stoker's Dracula, which we'll get into next episode. When I was doing research on Carmilla, I found a list of movies and series based on it. And one was Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1932 Vampire, okay, which really surprised me because I own this movie and I did not realize that literally the novella Carmilla, right here, it's in here, is included in the Criterion Collection edition. Dreyer's Vampire is supposed to be like more broadly paced on 4 of the novellas in Les Fanus and A Glass Darkly. But still, when I was reading Carmilla, like nothing resonated or felt familiar. And so I rewatched Vampire thinking, oh, now I'll be able to pick out the subtleties. And no, it's nothing like Carmilla, beside there being a teenage girl who was infected by a vampire by an old lady who walks with a cane. And you could argue that the very, very end is similar, I guess. There is one scene, however, that comes directly from Dracula, and we'll look at that next episode. So make sure that you click that notification bell if you don't want to miss it. And lastly, I've included further reading in the description below if you'd like to dig deeper. And until next time, happy reading. Bye.